Hello, everybody. This is Max, and welcome back to Equals.
Welcome to Equals, everyone. This is Naf from surprisingly sunny London.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful winter's day. So, Naf, what's news with you?
Right now, I'm reading the sci-fi by Octavia Butler. It's a great book, but the reason I start reading it is to escape my reality. Our reality these days. But the book starts, with the Earth after a nuclear war. So it actually ended up depressing me and brought me back to reality.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like a happy read. There's plenty of war in our lives at the moment without without reaching for books, isn't there?
I know. I know everywhere you look, every day when I'm trying to read the news, it's all about the war. And it's so terrible what's happening in Lebanon and Gaza and the Middle East, in Sudan. I mean, it's honestly, Max, like depressing.
It is, and we both got good colleagues and friends in Lebanon, in particular, and the Israeli bombardment, the invasion. It's just been so awful the last week.
You know our colleague Dana, yeah? Last week she was telling me she left Lebanon for a meeting right before things escalated. And she said something that really broke my heart, which is, she said, I can't go home. There's no way for me to go home. And it just made me realize how, from one day to the next, your life totally changes, gets destroyed.
I can't even begin to imagine. And to see them all, continuing to do their jobs, continuing to, be colleagues and work for Oxfam and do policy work and research. And I just don't know how they do it. I admire them, and it breaks my heart as well.
Same, same. I share the same feeling, Max. But I also feel like no one should, be experiencing this. So, Max, this week, who is our guest? Who are we interviewing?
Oh, that's amazing. We are interviewing Jayati Ghosh. She's a famous academic, an activist, a campaigner. She teaches at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the US. And honestly, Jayati is an advocate and campaigner on so many issues that we also work on as Oxfam. And she's such a leader on issues like debt and tax, but also unpaid care, climate change, colonialism. I mean, you name it. And she's in the forefront of pushing the envelope and fighting for justice in those areas. So she's just an amazing woman. So it was a really good interview, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. And I'm sure most of our listeners know about Jayati. She's a powerful speaker, and, I can listen to her all day and night. So, really excited that we get a chance to interview her.
Yes, let's listen to it.
Jayati, it's incredible having you with us. In your experience as a development economist and also activist, do you believe global inequality is improving or is it getting worse? And how would you respond to those who argue that the world is getting better, it's getting richer overall, and inequality isn't really a problem?
I think it's true that the world is getting richer overall, that if you're taking it the world as a whole, but I believe that it is definitely much more unequal than it was even when I was young, which is already half a century ago, actually. And I believe that the idea that, it's all fine because we have enough in the world, let's say to feed everyone or to make sure everybody has decent housing and so on, in the aggregate, that is unfortunately not good enough because we are actually experiencing many millions of people in much worse material conditions than even their parents or grandparents.
Certainly since COVID, the gap between the rich world and the global south is growing for the first time in decades. I mean, do you see that as a kind of aberration, or do you think that maybe that we're switching into a different groove where that might become more and more the case?
I really hope it doesn't become the case, but certainly, yeah, all the indications are that there are both sort of systemic and structural features and conjunctural forces that are going to make this spatial inequality worse, the gap between the rich countries and the lower income countries. I do believe that as we are experiencing more uncertainties, as we experience more potential pandemics, We're going to see much more of what we saw during COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to see much more of rich country governments trying to grab resources, therapeutics, and whatever it takes to be ahead. We're going to see much more antipathy towards migration and towards climate refugees. And we're going to see policies that are designed to keep developing or lower income countries pretty much subservient.
So, one of the things you've talked a lot about recently with your work for Earth for All is this link between climate breakdown and inequality, which is also a big theme for Oxfam. Can you tell us a bit more about how you came to approach climate change from this perspective of inequality?
Yes, I think what is really interesting is that so much of the climate discussion is still somehow ignoring inequality. Whereas to me, there are really two dimensions of inequality, and we cannot understand either the whole process of climate change or how we can fix it without looking at both dimensions. The first dimension obviously is that between the countries that have so far managed to exploit the rest of the world in terms of nature, in terms of carbon emissions, and through various other strategies and colonial policies. The rich countries, around 15% of the global population currently, and the rest of the world. So there is that, of course. And we know that that difference in terms of per capita emissions, in terms of per capita resource use, all of those things are huge. But there is another very important inequality, which is that within countries and really between the rich in the whole world and the rest of us. And of course, you at Oxfam have done some fantastic work on this, which I use a lot. But it is really striking how much we tend to forget that when you think about what's happened over the last 15, 20 years, it's not that the poor or the bottom half of the population in the rich countries has been emitting more carbon. It's really the rich, including the very rich that reside in many of our countries. So the top 10% of the world is responsible for around half of global emissions. But what's also striking is that those have gone up massively. Their per capita emissions have increased massively, whereas the per capita emissions of the bottom half in practically every region of the world are either declining or stagnant.
I was surprised myself to discover that half the people in the UK have never been on an aeroplane. The idea that these people are flying around the world emitting carbon is just a fallacy.
Yes, absolutely. And, often we even don't realize then they say, oh, Americans use their cars so much. It's because the structure of the way they've done their habitations, their urban settlements, the way they've classified occupations, it's really impossible to go out for work without a car. So, in other words, it's really that you're creating conditions for people who would much rather not have to do all these things and then saying, well, no, no, you're using too much carbon. I have to confess that this inability to look at inequality both globally and within countries is what drives me crazy, even with a lot of progressives talking about global warming or what to do about it. I mean, the idea of one carbon price. Frankly, it's unacceptable within a country as much as it is globally. I will believe in one global carbon price when we have one global wage. But in any case, I would not say that the poor in even Europe or North America who are, let's say, suddenly facing dramatically increased heating costs in winter, I don't think that's the best way to resolve this problem at all. When they are not the ones responsible for the massive emissions, what we're really talking about is the rich and really the ultra rich of the world being able to do exactly what they want, and a rise in the carbon price to what is seen as a sustainable, desirable price will mean nothing to them. It makes no difference at all. It will have no impact on their consumption.
Very true, Jayati. I think for me, it's not only about understanding, the inequality in terms of who caused the climate crisis, but it's also about the transition. Because as you mentioned, huge exploitation of resources has resulted into this crisis. Of course, the richest have benefited from it. They are largely responsible for the emissions and so on. But in terms of the transition that is required, it will also require a huge amount of resources. And again, who's going to be benefiting from that system? So it's really important to talk about this inequality at the global level, but also within countries. The other thing we want to talk to you about, Jayati, is how does the fight to recognize and redistribute care work linked to the fight to build a more economically equal world?
I think care work has been one of those huge blind spots, certainly within economics, but particularly within policy, public policy. But I shouldn't say blind because I have given up talking about gender blind policies now for about a decade. I don't believe they're gender blind. I believe they're gender exploitative. I believe that public policy knows fully well about the significant importance of unpaid work within families, within communities, but most of all for the economy as this enormous substratum that is actually subsidizing the recognized and formal economy. But it uses the fact of unpaid labor to cushion the impact of a whole bunch of other policies. I mean, fiscal austerity, for example, you can cut back on a whole range of activities. You can reduce the care provided by hospitals, you can reduce public services in a range of things because you know that somebody somewhere will have to keep doing that. And you know that it will happen within families and households, largely by women and girls, because that's the way we still do the gender division of labor in most countries. So the issue of care, it's not just about inequality. I think we fail to recognize, first of all, how crucial it is for capitalist accumulation and how little of any of the global economic trajectories that we've seen, or even the so called developmental success stories that we've seen, could have occurred without relying very, very heavily on this unpaid care economy.
I mean, it's like, I think of it like a giant shock absorber. They can get away with it, can't they? Because they know someone will pick up the pieces.
Exactly. And they use it at every level of per capita GDP. They certainly use it in Europe and the US in terms of, reducing previously much better kinds of care services. But they use it in India big time, even in very, very, when already care services were unprovided or underprovided, you cut back further and really stretch women in particular to the absolute limit. And you can keep doing that because it's kind of somehow, as you say, it's this enormous shock absorber. And because unfortunately, half of the population doesn't really recognize it, even because they end up not doing very much of it, it doesn't become even a major political issue.
Oh, I also think there's a class aspect too, isn't there? Because I remember when I was living in Kenya, the level of domestic help that the upper classes have is so enormous that all of the unpaid care is kind of not done by the householders. There's a sense in which it's all kind of outsourced. So you've got that strange combination of men don't notice it and rich people don't really notice it because they're paying someone else. So it's even more invisibilized because of that.
Oh, absolutely. But remember, that's the other thing that you see all the paid care workers that you notice, the domestic workers and so on, these are still paid workers. They would still be classified in the employment statistics. What is not counted is the fact that they have to go home and do that double burden. They have to go home and look after their families and children and elderly and so on in unpaid fashion.
Oxfam and you and many others have written for years about the kind of global economic system being unequal, about how the global north have all these advantages and they're kind of extracting. I think in recent years, there's been a real kind of welcome renaissance in describing that kind of system as colonial or imperial. What do you think that adds to the debate? We've been talking about extractive supply chains as long as I can remember, and people at the bottom fueling the benefits of owners in the north. But it does feel like there's something different calling that a kind of neo-colonial or kind of modern day colonial system. What do you think that adds?
I personally, I recognize exactly the phenomenon you're describing, and I think it's still very strong and definitely critical out there. But I personally prefer the term and the concept imperialism, which to me is the struggle of large capital over economic territory when it is supported and assisted by states. So, really, it's large capital of any kind and in any sphere, which is looking for and trying to control and grab economic territory. And that economic territory can be anything. It can be land, for sure. That was one of the major things. Different kinds of products of nature, mineral resources, and so on, forests. It can be oil. It can be any of those classic things that colonialism was all about. But it can also be labor. It can be access to markets. That's also a kind of economic territory. It can be all the new economic territory that has really been created by capitalism in its later phases, like intellectual property, which really was not a thing 30, 40 years ago, or cyberspace. So capitalism creates these forms of new economic territory, and then there are these massive struggles over who will control them. And so the large capital, it typically relies on its home state to support it in doing that. And that support can take all kinds of forms. It can take, of course, political, geopolitical strategies. It can take, making offers that other governments find hard to refuse. It can be economic power, market power of different kinds. But it also typically relies on some local elites who benefit from this process. And that's a fundamental part of imperialism, the use of local elites to do that kind of exploitation of a particular population.
So we're missing that analysis, I think. If we look at the riots in Kenya recently, which I've been following closely with lots of colleagues who live in Nairobi, most of them actually joined the demonstrations. And there was a sense that the agency of the Kenyan government was taken away. And a lot of the commentaries were about the IMF and all these external colonial and neo colonial forces. And I think it's important to get the balance in the narrative in terms of how much was the IMF's fault and how much was Kenya's government fault. Because as we stand now, it seems the balance of the narrative is tipped towards putting all the blame on the IMF and somehow taking the agency away from these global south elites who also play a role in this process, and they have an agency, to do the right thing or the wrong thing.
I think you're probably right about, let's say, the Western commentary, the progressive Western commentary being about that. But I don't think if you had talked to many of the demonstrators that they would not have seen that the Ruto regime was very much responsible as well, right?
No, absolutely. Yeah. In the country, I was really surprised how people really did both. I mean, they understood who the IMF were, they understood their role, but they no way were they letting the government off the hook. You're absolutely right.
Yes, and it's also because very often the government is in cahoots with the large external private capital, the bondholders and others, and the IMF in doing what they're doing to their population.
In terms of this debt crisis that we face at the moment, you've been doing a lot of work on that. And for those of us who've been around for a long time, it does feel like it's a circle, doesn't it? It comes around. And how do you see this fixing itself?
I don't even know if it will fix itself. I mean, people say Greece has come out of its debt crisis. It has, but at what cost? And with a whole generation lost and massive migrations of anyone who was young and educated and able to go and so on. I fear that because these countries are having to sort of go it alone and deal with all the creditors and the IMF and the bilaterals and everybody alone, and they're not able to combine to sort of get a better deal, that they will all be forced into these dreadful, lingering, prolonged suffering. And then 20 years from now, they will say, oh, Ghana's come out of its debt crisis, or Chad is finally recovering, or. And of course, for the global media and the financial press, recovery is basically when bondholders think it's safe to go back in.
Yeah, and then it all starts again. Yeah, exactly.
But for the people, it can be really devastating. It could well be, I don't know, not just one lost decade, several lost decades. I really do feel it because they're not seen as systemically important. This debt crisis doesn't really matter for global finance. It's not big enough to worry them. Just look at the differential response. When Silicon Valley Bank or Syndicate Bank in California were going to go under, they went over the top in terms of the response. In 3 days, they had worked out this major bailout. They had done things which are actually already illegal in their own laws in terms of providing the guarantee to every single depositor, no matter how large the deposits. They did all that to save just these two banks. When Credit Suisse was going under, the Swiss, who are apparently notoriously law abiding and rigid in their rules and so on, did the same thing over a weekend. They put together a bailout and a deal which contravened their own laws. I mean, and they're actually facing lawsuits about it now because they just felt they had to do whatever it takes. They don't feel that way about any of the debt crises in the developing world. So they can't be bothered, and they're just going to be allowed to fester and destroy entire generations.
Jayati, so for the past 2, 3 years, everyone is talking about restructuring the global financial architecture, the global economic system. We need to decolonize it and so on. Do you see any hope in this, or how do you see these conversations progressing?
Yes, enough. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish I didn't have to say this because I have been part of so many efforts to provide proposals, and there's no shortage of really obvious, excellent, and doable proposals. And I've been also involved in these boards and commissions that try and write them up, and we all get very excited, thinking, yes, we can put this, and then it will be accepted. But nothing changes. And yeah, so it is. I mean, it's hard to think that there is a major shift. There's a lot more talk about it. But admit there was a lot more talk about inequality globally over the past decade, right? And yet inequality has increased during that period when the talk about it has increased. Similarly, with the global financial architecture, there's some rigidities which are impossible to somehow undo. The US has 16% of the quota and therefore the voting. Okay, they can stop anything because you need 85% of the vote for any significant change, even something as simple as changing the rules to allocate SDRs, which is really minor, low lying fruit, really. But the US will veto it and that's it, it's over. And we know the US will veto it not only because the US Fed or the Treasury or the government doesn't like it, but because the US Congress is so crazy and dysfunctional. So no matter who is in power, the US Congress will not allow this to happen. I personally have begun to think that we will not get any real change unless we get much more coordination and coalitions among developing countries. I think that's really the missing step that we have to take. It's not just that people in the IFIs are going to see the light, or that the rich country governments are going to suddenly become good and become Nobel Peace Prize winning people who decide to do something for others. It is that they will have to feel the pressure, and they're not feeling that pressure. We really need much more combination of governments in the developing world pushing for progressive policies.
I mean, one thing in that direction you've been closely involved in is the Brazilians' push on taxing the rich, which seems quite positive. And I mean, do you see more scope for developing countries coming together that way in the next few years, or do you think there's
No,
more?
I think of all of the current multilateral initiatives, the one on taxation is the one that gives me the most hope, the most sense that there is really some traction there. Because let's face it, it's in the interests of everybody except the ultra rich and the major corporations, right? Including in rich countries. In fact, rich country governments will get the lion's share of the tax revenues, no matter which formula we use. But it would mean huge differences for most low and middle income countries in terms of just the basics that you need to provide minimal health care, minimal nutrition, minimal social protection, and so on. So it's in that way, it's a win-win for everybody, except for a few ultra rich people who would not notice the difference, let's be honest, because it's such a small share of their wealth or income. And mega corporations, again, who barely would notice that difference. It's just that they feel they're congenitally disinclined to go in for any parting of their wealth.
I mean, and this is the last question, so but really, it's more about your motivations. You've been doing this for quite a while.
Yes.
As you say, you've been in lots of situations where fabulous proposals have been put forward, and there has been progress. I mean, there have been good things, but how do you keep cheerful?
Okay, that's enough to make me laugh, I guess, suppose. Okay, here's the thing. I think the reason why any of us do this, including all of you at Oxfam, and I think you're also doing a great job on all of these issues. I think the reason any of us do this is because somewhere inside we are convinced that humanity has to step back from the brink. And I think all of us have a sense that we're close to the brink, yes, that there is a precipice and we're just walking towards it in all kinds of different ways. And somewhere inside me, I believe that humanity is going to step back from this brink. And so you keep pushing for whatever you think can help in stepping back from that and charting a different course. And I think that's the reason why any of us keep doing whatever we're doing. But the thing that gives me hope that we will is actually when I interact with young people. So, fortunately, in my job, I do have to interact with young people. I have to interact with students and graduates, researchers and scholars. But I also get to meet a lot of young people, when we're out in these demos and public places, or when we're in general situations, when they want to come and have discussions on issues. And what really strikes me about most of the young people I meet, I mean, of course, it may be that they are a self selected minority, but what is really striking to me is that they don't get as depressed as we do. I mean, somehow I think we are softer. We grew up in a much more friendly and forgiving environment. We didn't grow up even with the knowledge of climate change. I found out about it in my 30s, really. And we didn't have to face the really insecure material world that all of them have to face, whether it is employment or it is the kinds of terrible violence and tensions or all of the inequality. We didn't have that extreme experience, I think, in our lives. They have grown up in it, and yet they are not as zapped by it as I am. They say, okay, we know that this is the thing and we're going to deal with it. I have been absolutely astounded at the courage of my students in India, many of whom are still in jail, and have such faith, such hope, and who keep doing it despite all the odds. And I see some of that in many of the young people, even here.
Thank you so much, Jayati. That was an incredible interview. We really appreciate it. Wow, what an interview. So much in there. What stood out for you?
So, two things. One is, how Jayati said for the global north, like the economy of the global north, or, to maintain the standard of living, the global south has to be kept subservient. But tied with that, what really stood out to me is, we're always blaming the IMF or these colonial and neo-colonial actors. And I think we really have to find a balance in terms of the narrative. We cannot just put all the blame on these actors. We also have to put part of the blame on leaders from the global south, yeah? Like African leaders, for instance, Kenyan leaders have a responsibility to stand to the IMF and say no.
Yeah, I think that's true. That balancing act between agency and whose fault is it? I also think she went a bit further than that, and she pointed out that elites in the global south, it's not always just the fact that they're not brave enough to stand up to the IMF and the bond holders, but she said quite often they're in cahoots, which I think is a great word. But, it's this idea that, as elites in the global south, they have actually got more in common and more ideological links and went to the same universities, or they have affinities with people outside of the country more than they do with their own people. And I think that's another key point.
Exactly, Max. A really important key point.
So, the other thing that she's always brilliant on, Jayati, and we interviewed her a whole episode on the podcast about this a couple of years ago, is the issue of paid and unpaid care work and its kind of structural link to this process of inequality and accumulation. And I thought she was fantastic on that today.
Yes, and I also really loved how she said, we need to stop saying gender blind policy, that there are gender exploitative policies. And of course, this is on purpose, no? And I also loved what you said about, this being a shock absorber. Ultimately, women are the ones, I think, who pay a huge price in the system that we're living in.
Yeah, they know, within reason, policymakers and corporates know that if there are huge cutbacks to welfare, like we're seeing with austerity around the world, that the pieces will be picked up. People will be looked after. Children will be cared for if there's no school to go to. The sick will be cared for if there's no hospital or clinic, and it will be women who largely do that. So I think that was really, really powerful what she said on that.
Yes, and I think we need to continue exploring this theme in our upcoming podcast as well, Max.
Yeah, well, talking of upcoming podcasts, what we've got coming up, I know we're doing one on inequality in South Africa. I think another one on inequality in Mexico.
We also are going to cover the Kenya riots. There's also one coming on climate finance. So a lot of cool episodes coming.
Yeah, so please stay tuned, everybody. Recommend us to your friends, family, and people you meet in the street. And we'll see you next time on Equals.
Have a good weekend and speak soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.